I have reviewed the footage 41 times. I want to be precise about that number, because precision matters in this field and because the alternative, saying I lost count, would be professionally embarrassing and personally accurate. 41 times in 6 weeks. My junior analyst Sevaketh stopped counting her own viewings after the 3rd week and told me she had begun watching the corridor segment in particular during her sleep cycle, which I understood to mean she was not sleeping. I told her to take 3 days leave. She came back after one and said the time away had not helped. I did not press her. The incident at the V3 diplomatic convocation, 7th Hall, 53rd day of the unification cycle, has been classified, reclassified, and reclassified again at successively higher tiers of restriction, which is the conclave's way of saying they do not know what to do with it. The footage itself is not in question. The physical evidence is not in question. The survivor testimony has been cross-verified at 7 independent sites. What is in question? What has consumed this Institute's analysis team for 6 weeks? What has produced 14 draft reports and 0 final ones? Is the category we use to file what the human did. We do not have one. I am Kethurava. I hold the V3 Institute's 3rd chair in diplomatic xenobiology, which means I study alien species as they behave in structured diplomatic settings rather than in their natural environments. I am not a military analyst. I am not a threat assessment specialist. The conclave assigned this to my division because they initially believed it was a behavioral anomaly, a misread of protocol, a translation error in the human's command hierarchy, perhaps a neurochemical incident, something explainable, something that fit. 6 weeks later, I am producing this oral record because the written reports have not satisfied the conclave, and because my voice, apparently, carries a steadiness that the documents do not. I will try to maintain that steadiness. The diplomatic convocation was a summit of 12 species, 14 if you count the human delegation and the Earth observers, who maintain a presence at all major gatherings without formally participating. The purpose of the convocation was the ratification of the 7th Corridor Accord, a trade and transit agreement 7 cycles in negotiation. Nothing about it was unusual. It was the kind of event this hall had hosted 30 times. The V3 Queen's participation was ceremonial. She presides, she witnesses the ratification, she speaks the formal words of binding. The actual political work had been finished 2 cycles prior. The summit was, in the most precise sense, a formality. The human delegation was also ceremonial. 3 diplomats, 1 communications officer, and a 2-person security detail. The security detail's presence was itself a formality, the kind of diplomatic courtesy that says, we take this seriously enough to staff it properly, without any real expectation that their function would be exercised. Human security personnel at diplomatic events are decorative, in the same way that the ceremonial guards outside the hall's main entrance are decorative. This was the conclave's assumption. It was also, I should say for the record, my assumption. The 2 members of the human security detail were a woman named Specialist Yara Allen and a man named Sergeant Marcus Den. I had their service records pulled in the first week of the investigation. Specialist Allen had 8 years of service, most of it in human planetary surface security operations, 2 citations for conduct in active scenarios. Sergeant Den had 11 years, 3 citations, a medical notation for a shoulder reconstruction following an incident in his 6th year that had healed by all accounts to full function. He was 43 years old. He had a photograph in his personnel file taken 4 years prior in which he is standing in what appears to be a forested area on the human home world, holding a fish of some kind, squinting against bright light, and smiling in a way that suggests the photograph was taken by someone he was fond of. I mention the photograph because I have thought about it many times in the past 6 weeks, and I am not entirely sure why. The convocation proceeded through its first 2 sessions without incident. The 7th Corridor Accord moved through its ratification phases. Speeches were given. Symbolic gestures were exchanged. The human diplomats participated in the formal exchanges with the practiced neutrality of species who have attended enough of these events to know the rhythm. Sergeant Den stood at his post, which was the left flank of the V3 Queen's reception alcove. A decorative posting, I emphasize, situated so that the diplomatic delegation's security presence was visible from the main hall but not physically between any of the participants. He stood there for 4 hours across the first 2 sessions, and by all security footage review, appeared to do nothing except exist in his designated position. I have gone back and watched him during those 4 hours. He is not inattentive. That is the thing I noticed on the 3rd or 4th review. He is not standing in the way that a decorative guard stands, which is to say he is not performing the function of looking present. He is watching, not the speakers, not the ceremony. He is watching the entrances, the structural joints above the secondary tier, the gap between the Arith observer's platform and the Eastern Service corridor. He does this methodically in a pattern that repeats approximately every 4 minutes, and then he returns to the beginning of the pattern, for 4 hours, without apparent fatigue or distraction. My analyst Velorath, who handles behavioral classification, flagged this in her 3rd-week report and called it environmental mapping. She said she had seen similar behavior in prey species observers placed in unfamiliar settings, except in those cases the behavior is anxiety-driven and degrades over time as the organism either habituates or exhausts itself. In Sergeant Den, it did not degrade. It remained constant for the full 4 hours. She noted this in her report, and then crossed it out and then put it back. I want to be honest in this record. Nothing about those 4 hours suggested what was coming. I have watched them 41 times, and I do not see a human soldier preparing for something. I see a man doing a job the way he would do any job. I see thoroughness. That is all. I want to dwell on those 4 hours a moment longer, because I think they matter, and because my written reports have treated them as background. Velorath's behavioral classification note, the one she crossed out and put back, contains a secondary observation she did not develop at length. She noted that the environmental mapping pattern Sergeant Den maintained was not random in its sequence. He returned to the same points of interest in the same order, every 4 minutes, without apparent variation. The Eastern Service corridor. The upper structural joints along the secondary tier, which she noted are the kind of access point that a threat assessment mind would identify as a potential approach vector. The gap between the Arith platform and the wall behind it, a gap wide enough, she measured it on the building schematic, for a person to pass through if they pressed laterally. The main floor entrances, which he scanned last in each cycle, as though they were the lowest probability risk. She asked whether this meant he had assessed the Eastern Corridor as the highest risk. I reviewed the footage again after reading her note. I cannot confirm that he had assessed it as the highest risk, but I can say that when the breach came at the 48th minute, when the 4 individuals entered through the Eastern Service corridor, his head had already turned toward that corridor 2 seconds before the breach indicator on the hall's security system registered the intrusion. 2 seconds. I do not know what to do with that detail. I have included it here because it is in the footage, and because I believe accurate records matter even when the data points are uncomfortable. I am not claiming Sergeant Den knew. I am saying his attention was already where the event happened, and it was there before the event happened, and that is the record. At the 47th minute of the 3rd session, the Arith observer platform malfunctioned, or appeared to malfunction. I will not detail the mechanics of what followed because those details are documented in the security report, and because the specifics of the attack are not what this analysis is about. What is material is this. 4 individuals entered the hall through the Eastern Service corridor at the 48th minute, armed, moving toward the ratification dais where the V3 Queen was standing for the formal closing ceremony. The V3 Honor Guard, 12 personnel positioned around the main floor and the dais approaches, had a response time, per their own standing doctrine, of approximately 6 to 8 seconds for a threat identified at the Eastern Corridor distance. I have reviewed their response carefully, and I want to be fair about it. The individuals who entered were not a standard threat profile. The weapon system they carried, I will simply note that it is a class of weapon the Conclave's own security assessment rated as capable of significant area neutralization, triggered in V3 Honor Guard personnel, a response that their training did not override. This is not a criticism. The V3 are not, as a species, equipped by either biology or doctrine to hold position against that specific threat signature at close range. The guards did what their training told them to do when a threat exceeds the manageable threshold. They moved to secure egress routes and called for reinforcement. Some moved faster than others. Within 11 seconds of the initial breach, the dais area contained the 4 armed individuals, the V3 Queen, 3 diplomats from other species who had not yet processed the situation fully, and Sergeant Marcus Den. Specialist Allen had moved to secure the human diplomatic team in the secondary alcove, which was her assigned protocol function in an active threat scenario. This was correct procedure. This is what she was supposed to do. Sergeant Den had moved to the V3 Queen. He had covered the distance between his post and the Queen's position in approximately 2 seconds, which I mention only because the distance was not trivial. The reception alcove is separated from the ratification dais by roughly 8 meters, and the floor between them had, in the preceding seconds, become occupied by moving personnel going in the opposite direction. He moved through them. I do not know how to describe it better than that. He moved through the crowd going the other way and arrived at the Queen's position, and placed himself between her and the primary line of approach. He was not ordered to do this. The human diplomatic security protocol does not assign protective responsibility for foreign heads of state to a 2-person bilateral detail. He had no formal obligation to be where he went. The Conclave's own legal analysis, produced in week 2 of this review, confirmed that Sergeant Den was acting outside the scope of his assigned function when he stepped to the Queen's position. He was not there because protocol demanded it. I will come back to why he was there. What happened in the following 90 seconds is documented in detail in the security report. I will summarize for the purposes of this record. The reinforcement arrived at the 90-second mark. The situation was resolved. The V3 Queen was not harmed. 2 of the 4 individuals who entered through the Eastern Corridor were neutralized by reinforcement personnel. 2 were detained. The casualties among the attending species were 3 individuals with non-fatal injuries sustained in the initial confusion. Sergeant Marcus Den was hospitalized for 11 days. I want to take a moment with that sentence, because the first time I wrote it in my preliminary report, I wrote it and moved past it as though it were a logistical data point. And then I went back and looked at the footage again, and I understood that the sentence is doing considerably more work than its grammar suggests. When I say hospitalized for 11 days, I mean he sustained injuries consistent with proximity to a weapon discharge of the type used in the incident. He sustained 2 separate physical impacts from close quarters intervention with the detained individuals. He sustained a refracture of the previously reconstructed shoulder. And he sustained additional injuries that the V3 medical team who treated him documented with some apparent difficulty, because the team was not fully familiar with human physiology at the level of detail the injuries required. He was conscious throughout. This is the part the medical team flagged for us. He was conscious and communicative during triage, during initial treatment, and during the first 2 days of his hospital stay, at which point the V3 medical team administered a sedative compound to facilitate recovery, because, as the attending physician noted in the treatment record, he was not doing it himself. He was not sedating himself, he was awake. The medical team initially believed this was a malfunction of the sedation dosage, that the human's physiology was metabolizing the compound faster than expected. They adjusted the dosage. The attending physician noted in a follow-up entry that the adjustment produced the intended effect, but that she had needed to consult with the human diplomatic team's own medical officer about the correct threshold, and that the medical officer had, when asked, given her a number that she had double-checked because it was substantially higher than the initial estimate, and she had wanted to confirm it was not an error. It was not an error. This detail, the sedation threshold, was the first data point that shifted my team's analysis. It was not the central one, but it was the first. I should be honest about the state of this investigation in its first week. The initial framing was straightforward. A human security officer without authorization expanded his protective function to include a foreign head of state during an active threat event, acted in that capacity, and was injured in the process. The questions were operational. Why did he act outside his assigned scope? Was this a violation of the bilateral security protocols? And what did it indicate about human delegation security doctrine? These are administrative questions. They have administrative answers. I was told to produce an administrative report. I began producing an administrative report. In the second week, my analyst Veloreth flagged the pre-incident behavioral footage I described, the environmental mapping pattern. She asked whether it indicated that Sergeant Den had been aware of a threat before the rest of the hall's security apparatus was. I reviewed the footage. I do not believe it indicated prior threat awareness. What it indicated was something more uncomfortable. It indicated that the behavior in the 3-session period before the incident was not decorative behavior. He had not been standing at his post the way a decorative guard stands. He had been doing what, in retrospect, was the actual version of his job. What the job would look like if it were taken seriously in an environment where taking it seriously was not expected. I flagged this for the conclave liaison on the 14th day. He told me it was operationally interesting, but not relevant to the administrative report. I noted his guidance and continued the review. The administrative report shifted on day 22. Day 22 was when we received the debrief transcript. Sergeant Den had been debriefed by the human diplomatic team's own security coordinator 9 days after the incident, when he was sufficiently recovered to participate in a formal interview. We received a copy as a matter of diplomatic transparency. It had not been requested, which I note because this means the human delegation chose to provide it without being asked. I do not know if this is standard practice for human diplomatic security debriefs. I suspect it may not be. I read the transcript. I have read it since then, many more times than I have watched the footage. The debrief is conducted in the style of a formal after-action review. The interviewer, the human security coordinator, a woman named Rennick, asks questions about the sequence of events, the decision points, the actions taken. Sergeant Den answers in the flat, technical register of someone who has done this kind of interview before. He is precise. He accounts for his movements, his choices, his assessment of the threat as it developed. He uses the specific language of military after-action analysis, which is to say he does not editorialize. He describes. At the 43rd minute of the transcript, Rennick asks him, "At what point did you assess that moving to the Queen's position was viable?" He is quiet for a moment. The transcript records this as a pause of approximately 4 seconds. Then he says, "I assessed it was not viable in the standard sense. I assessed I would not likely make it through without significant injury and approximately a 60% chance of fatality given the weapon profile." Rennick says, "And you moved anyway?" He says, "Yes." She says, "Walk me through that decision." He is quiet again. The transcript records 7 seconds. Then he says, "There was no decision. I don't mean that as an operational note. I mean it literally. I did not decide to go. I was at my post and she was at the dais, and then I was moving. I have run this back several times since, and I cannot locate a decision point. There was a recognition. I saw the breach. I assessed the threat profile. I understood where the guards were going and where she was and what that meant. And then I was moving. It wasn't a choice I made in the conventional sense of that word. It was the thing that happened. Rennick says, "You're training." He says, "I know what you're thinking. It's not training. I've had situations before where training kicked in. This is different from that. Training overrides the flinch. This didn't feel like overriding anything. This felt like I don't have a good word for it, like the alternative wasn't available." Rennick says, "What does that mean?" He says, "The alternative was to not go, and I understood the option existed in an abstract sense. I knew I could move to cover the human delegation the way Alan was doing. I knew that was the protocol. I just couldn't make it happen. Not because I was paralyzed. Because she was at the dais and there was nothing between her and them, and the alternative was to let that be the case, and I couldn't let that be the case. That's the closest I can get to it." He says, "The alternative was to not go, and I understood the option existed in an abstract sense. I knew I could move to cover the human delegation the way Alan was doing. I knew that was the protocol. I just couldn't make it happen. Not because I was paralyzed. Because she was at the dais and there was nothing between her and them, and the alternative was to let that be the case, and I couldn't let that be the case. That's the closest I can get to it." Rennick says, "You had met her twice. The Queen, the receiving ceremony, and the precession briefing." He says, "Yes." She says, "You knew who she was." He says, "I knew she was the Queen. I knew her name. I knew what she looked like. I didn't know her." She says, "And that didn't factor in." He says, "No, I don't think it did. I don't think it would have mattered if I'd never seen her before in my life. She was there. The thing was happening to her. I was the available option. That's the whole of it." There is in the transcript at this point another pause. 7 seconds. Then Rennick says, "I want to be clear for the record. You are not being cited. This is not a disciplinary review. But I want to ask you, for my own understanding, if you had known for certain you wouldn't survive, would you have gone?" He is quiet for 12 seconds. The transcript records it as 12. Then he says, "I think that's a theoretical question that the situation didn't give me. I knew the probability was bad. I didn't know it for certain. I don't think knowing it for certain would have been different. But I genuinely can't say because I wasn't in that situation. I was in the one where the probability was bad and I went anyway." Rennick says, "Noted." He says, "For what it's worth, I think you're asking the wrong question." She says, "What's the right one?" He says, "Not what I would have done, what I did. The rest is philosophy." The transcript ends 11 minutes later, on a procedural note about the medical clearance timeline. I want to pause here and note something about the way I am reading this transcript, because I think my reading has changed between the first time I processed it and the 41st review. When I read it the first time, I read it as a soldier struggling to articulate a trained response in non-technical language, reaching for words to describe something that the language of after-action review does not fully accommodate. I found it interesting but not diagnostically significant. Soldiers often describe instinctive trained responses in ways that sound like something other than training. This seemed consistent with that pattern. By the third reading, I was not certain of that interpretation. By the 10th reading, I had stopped being certain of it entirely. The thing that changed is this. I began cross-referencing the transcript with the biological review that our medical liaison had compiled from the treating physician's records and from the human medical officer's consultations. The biological review is a dry document. It does not make claims. It records. What it records is this. At the time of the incident, the physiological profile of Sergeant Marcus Den included elevated neurochemical markers consistent with acute threat recognition. a stress response that the human body initiates automatically without cognitive direction when a threat is assessed as immediate. This is not unusual. All known species with comparable nervous systems produce some version of this response. The difference is in what the response produces. In most species, the acute threat response produces one of three behavioral outputs: flight from the threat, freeze in response to the threat, or in species with particularly robust combat conditioning, an aggressive movement toward the threat. The calculus is approximately: assess survival probability, select behavior most likely to maximize it. Sergeant Den's neurochemical profile at the time of the incident is consistent with acute threat recognition. It is not consistent with a survival optimization calculation. The stress markers are present. The survival optimization output is not. What the biological review records, in clinical language I am going to translate somewhat loosely, is that the neurochemical state he was in is a state that, in V3 and in most documented species, would produce either flight or freeze behavior, because the threat profile was assessed, by his own neural processing, as exceeding the survivable threshold. He knew, in the way that bodies know things before minds articulate them, that the probability of survival if he moved toward that dais was low. And the output was forward motion. The medical liaison, Rethova, who produced the biological review, included a note at the end that is not typical of his documents. Rethova is precise and reticent by nature, and has worked in xenobiology for 19 cycles without, to my knowledge, producing anything resembling an editorial comment in a clinical report. The note at the end of his review reads, "The data above indicates that the behavior in question was not a failure of threat assessment. The threat was assessed correctly. The behavior did not follow from the assessment in the way that standard neurological models predict. I do not have an explanatory framework that accounts for this, and I am uncomfortable filing a report that contains data I cannot explain. I am filing it anyway because the data is what it is." I called Rethova after I read that note. I said I had not expected to see something like that from him in a clinical document. He said he had not expected to write it. He said he had gone back through everything he could find on human neurochemistry in high-threat environments, and that the literature confirmed, rather than resolved, his confusion. He said the human medical literature, their own documentation of this phenomenon, describes it in language that is not clinical. He had found multiple descriptions across different human disciplines, including some that were several hundred years old by their calendar. He said the human word he kept encountering was the word that human diplomatic translation renders, in the V3 tongue, as something approximately meaning devotion. He said he did not think this was a satisfying scientific explanation, and I agreed with him, and neither of us said anything for a moment. Then he said something that has stayed with me. He said, "What I find most interesting is not that the behavior occurred. Unusual behavior occurs. What I find most interesting is that the humans have a word for it. They have many words for it. They have had these words for a very long time. They have entire cultural and philosophical frameworks organized around this behavior, entire disciplines of study, entire traditions of practice, entire bodies of literature. They have been thinking about this thing for centuries, and they have not explained it either. They have just named it, multiple times in multiple languages, with slightly different nuances each time. None of the names are quite right, and they know the names are not quite right, and they have continued generating new ones." I asked him what he thought that indicated. He said, "It indicates they have been living with this thing for a very long time, and have decided that the inability to explain it does not require them to stop doing it." I found that observation, which is not a clinical observation, which would not belong in any report I know how to write, more useful than anything else in his document. I want to be careful here. I am aware that what I am about to describe in this report represents a departure from the kind of analysis my division typically produces, and I want to acknowledge that departure explicitly so it is recorded. I returned to the debrief transcript. I went back to the 43rd minute. I read the passage again. There was no decision. The alternative wasn't available. I had been reading this in my first several reviews as a soldier's rough translation of a trained response. I had been reading wasn't available, as meaning wasn't accessible under pressure, that the training locked out the alternative option because combat conditioning is designed to do exactly that. I do not read it that way anymore. I think what Sergeant Den was describing, as precisely as he was able with the language he had, was something that does not have a clean equivalent in the V3 taxonomy of behavior. I have spent 6 weeks looking for the equivalent. We have a category for conditioned response, the trained override of flinch behavior. We have a category for survival drive, the neurochemical push towards self-preservation. We have a category for hierarchical loyalty, the behavior of protecting a recognized superior at cost to oneself, which is documented in several species and which functions in those species as a form of extended self-preservation. The individual survives in the survival of the hierarchy. We have a category for what human literature calls sacrifice, which appears in our documents as a conscious, deliberated choice to trade one's survival for a specific outcome. Sergeant Den's behavior does not fit any of these categories cleanly. It is not conditioned response in the standard sense, because his own account and the biological data both indicate that no override was operating. There was no flinch to suppress. It is not survival drive, because the biological data indicates his neural threat assessment correctly identified the action as survival negative, and the action occurred anyway. It is not hierarchical loyalty in the documented sense, because the V3 Queen is not in his hierarchy. She is not his species. She is not his government. She is not his superior in any chain of command he belongs to. She was, at the moment he moved, a foreign head of state who had no formal relationship to him other than physical proximity in a shared space. And it is not sacrifice in the deliberated sense because he said himself, and I believe him, and the biological data supports this reading, that there was no decision point. Deliberated sacrifice requires a moment of choosing. He does not appear to have had one. What I am left with after 6 weeks of review is this. Sergeant Marcus Den moved to the Queen's position because she was there and she needed someone there, and he was the one who was there and could go. That is the full extent of the causal chain as I can reconstruct it. Not duty in the formal sense. Not love in the personal sense. Not calculation of any kind I can model. He was there, she was unprotected. Those two facts produced a third fact. He moved. The alternative, as he said, was not available, and I think what he meant by this, more precisely than he may have known how to say, is that the alternative was structurally absent from his processing. Not suppressed, not overridden, absent. I have been a xenobiologist for 22 cycles. I have studied 29 species in diplomatic settings. I have produced clinical analyses of behavioral patterns across a range of species whose neurochemistry and social architecture differ from one another in ways that should, in principle, make general patterns difficult to find. In 22 cycles I have found, again and again, that the general patterns exist, that, beneath the surface variation, the behavior of social organisms in high-stakes environments tends to follow recognizable shapes. Self-preservation is reliable. Hierarchy maintenance is reliable. Risk calculation is reliable. These are the deep structures, and they hold across species with much wider variance than I would have predicted when I started this work. I am telling you this because I want you to understand that when I say I do not have a category for what Sergeant Den did, I am not speaking from a limited sample size. In the 5th week of this review, I requested an interview with Sergeant Den directly. The human diplomatic team facilitated this. The conclave liaison approved it as a secondary data-gathering measure. The interview was conducted at the convalescent facility where Den completed his recovery. He had been cleared for full duty at the time of the interview. He came to the interview room, a small conference space on the 4th floor, which is the kind of neutral space these things happen in, and he was, as his photograph had suggested he might be, a man of medium height and middle age with a healing bruise along his left jaw and his right arm in a partial support brace and an expression that was difficult to read. Not guarded, not performing anything, simply present. I introduced myself and explained my role and what I was trying to understand. I told him I had reviewed the debrief transcript. I told him I had reviewed the biological data from his treatment. I told him I was trying to produce a complete analysis of the incident for the conclave, and that there was a gap in my analysis that I had not been able to close from the documentation alone. He listened to all of this. Then he said, "What's the gap?" I said, "I cannot identify a satisfactory explanatory category for the behavior at the 48th minute of the 3rd session. I have reviewed your account, the biological data, and the secondary literature, and I have not found a framework that accounts for what you did in a way that resolves the data." He thought about this for a moment, not in the way of someone who doesn't understand the question, in the way of someone deciding how to answer it honestly. He said, "I don't think there is one." I said, "Can you explain what you mean?" He said, "I mean I've had this conversation before, not with you specifically, but this conversation. People who weren't there trying to figure out why I did what I did, and I've tried every answer I know how to give, training, instinct, protocol. None of them are right, and I know they're not right, and the people asking know they're not right. And eventually the conversation gets to the same place. There isn't a clean reason. There's just the thing that happened." I said, "Is that not frustrating? The absence of an explanation." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know why you'd think it would be, but no, it's not frustrating, it's just what it is." I said, "The human literature on this subject. I have reviewed some of it through our diplomatic translation services, and I have found many different words for what you described. Duty, devotion, honor, love in a specific sense. None of them translate cleanly. Do any of them feel accurate to you?" He said, "Sure, some of them, all of them a little bit." I said, "Which one most closely?" He thought about it for what felt like a long time. Outside the conference room there was the sound of the facility's ventilation system, and distantly, other voices. He said, "I think the closest one, if I had to pick, I think it's that I was responsible for her. Not in the sense of, I was assigned to her, I wasn't. But in the sense of, in that moment she was the most vulnerable person in the room and I was the one who could do something about it, and so I was responsible for her. That's it. That's the whole thing." I said, "And the fact that you might not survive." He said, "Yeah, that was in there, I knew that." I said, "And it didn't change the outcome." He said, "No, it's like I told Rennick. The alternative wasn't it was there, but it wasn't. I understood it as a concept. I just couldn't do it." I asked him whether he would describe that as a limitation. He looked at me for a long moment. It was a look that was hard to characterize exactly, not offended, not puzzled. Something more like a person recalibrating something. He said, "No, I would not describe it as a limitation. I have not been able to stop thinking about that answer. Let me tell you what the conclave did with this information, and then I will tell you what I think it means." The conclave's response to the preliminary report was, initially, to classify the incident under bilateral security protocol deviation, a category that exists for situations in which a foreign security detail acts outside its assigned parameters during an event on V3-administered grounds. This is a low-tier administrative classification. It is the classification you use when a foreign guard steps slightly out of their designated zone during a reception, or when a security team's communication protocol doesn't match the host side expectation. It is, to be direct, the classification you use when you want to file something and move on. My division chief, Orath Sev, submitted the preliminary report under this classification on day 30 of the review. On day 32, the conclave liaison returned it. He did not tell us why. He did not, as is sometimes done, annotate the document with a requested revision. He simply returned it with a note that said the conclave found the current classification insufficient and requested that the analysis division provide a more complete account. Orethsev asked me to speak to the liaison directly. I did. The liaison, a senior official I have dealt with for many years, was, for the first time in my experience of him, unwilling to give me a clear direction. He said the conclave had reviewed the preliminary report and found the behavioral data problematic. I asked him what he meant by problematic. He said he meant that the data did not fit the available frameworks and that the conclave was not comfortable filing it under a framework that did not fit. I said, then what classification would they like? He said, that is what we would like your division to determine. This is the conclave's way of saying they have no answer either. They are not asking us to resolve a question they have already answered. They are asking us to name a thing they do not have a name for. My division has been attempting to do this for the remaining 2 weeks of this review. We have produced categories, rejected them, produced them again in slightly different form, and rejected them again. Veloreth suggested a category that translates roughly as reflexive self-extension to a dependent party, which captures the involuntary nature, but misses the fact that the Queen was not a dependent party in any relationship Den had with her. Rethova suggested a category borrowed from a much older V3 behavioral document, something from pre-Accord history, that describes the behavior of certain animals that will not leave an injured member of their social group even when remaining is fatal. This comes closer. But Sergeant Den is not acting on the basis of prior social relationship. He acted on the basis of her need and his proximity to it. He transferred the relationship into existence by acting on it. I have not found a category that contains all of these elements without residue. Here is what I believe. I want to say it plainly in this oral record, in a way that my written reports have danced around because the written form of this analysis requires me to hedge in ways that the oral form does not. I believe that what Sergeant Marcus Den did was not an anomaly. I believe it was representative. I believe this is not what humans do in exceptional circumstances. I believe this is what humans do, and the circumstances were exceptional enough that we could see it clearly. I have reviewed the secondary literature on human behavior in high-stress protective scenarios that my team compiled over the course of this investigation. The literature is substantial. It is not edge case documentation. It is not the record of rare outliers. It describes a pattern that appears across human history, across human cultures, across documented scenarios ranging from individual incidents to large-scale events. The pattern is this: humans, when they have assumed a protective relationship with another party, formally or informally, with a person they know or with a stranger, with a member of their own group or with a member of a different group entirely, will, under conditions of acute threat to that party, frequently act in ways that their own survival probability assessment does not recommend. I should be precise about what frequently means in this context, because precision matters and because my written reports have been somewhat evasive on this point. Frequently does not mean always. It does not mean reliably in the mechanical sense. It is not 100% and it is not 50% either. The human literature itself acknowledges this variability. What the human literature does across the disciplines, across the centuries of documentation, is treat this behavior not as an exception to be analyzed, but as an aspiration to be cultivated. The humans have institutions designed to produce it. They have traditions aimed at preserving examples of it. They have ceremonies in which they formally recognize individuals who have demonstrated it, and the nature of the recognition is not "this was an anomaly," but "this is the standard we hold ourselves to." That, to me, is the most clinically significant data point in the entire 6 weeks of this review. Not that the behavior occurred, that the species treats it as normative, that they build systems around it, that the word they use for it is not aberration. The frequency with which this occurs is, I will note, not 100%. Humans are not uniform. Some do not do this. The behavior varies by individual, by training, by context, but it is common enough, documented commonly enough, that I cannot classify it as anomalous. What I can classify it as the closest word I have found in any literature, in any language this institute has access to, in any framework my team has been able to examine, is something that the human texts call, variously, duty, devotion, love, honor, courage. None of these words translate cleanly into the V3 analytic vocabulary. The V3 diplomatic convocation, 7th Hall, hosted 30 diplomatic events before the 53rd day of the unification cycle. It has not hosted one since. The ratification of the 7th Corridor Accord was completed, formally, in a smaller chamber on the 17th day of the following cycle, with a reduced guest list and an increased security configuration. The configuration includes, by directive of the Conclave Security Division, a directive that was issued quietly, with no public announcement, human security personnel in integrated positions rather than delegated lateral posts. This directive was not explained in its official language. The official language cites a security architecture review and an updated assessment of human personnel capability classifications. What it does not say, what I know because I spoke to the liaison who oversaw its drafting, is that the classification underlying it was a new one. Not bilateral security protocol deviation. Not any existing category. A new designation, created for the purpose, which in its full formal language describes human protective personnel as operating under a functional capacity that the existing V3 security taxonomy did not previously account for. The liaison told me the new designation's formal name. I am not going to say it in this record because the designation is restricted, and because the precise language of it is less important than what it means. What it means, what the conclave, through its usual oblique methods, has concluded and formalized without stating plainly, is that there is something humans do in the protective capacity that falls outside the range of what the V3 security taxonomy was designed to contain. It is not superior strength. It is not superior speed or weapons capability or tactical intelligence. It is the other thing. The thing Rethova called devotion. The thing Sergeant Den called the alternative not being available. The conclave has decided to put that thing to work. They have not articulated why they find it valuable. They do not need to. The footage from the 48th minute of the 3rd session articulates it adequately. 12 guards responded to the threat the way their training said to respond. One human responded differently. The training of the 12 guards was appropriate to the threat. The response of the one human was not the product of training in any way the analysis has been able to confirm. The Queen was not harmed. I want to end this record with something I have thought about a great deal and have not included in any of my written reports, because it does not belong in a written report, and I am not certain it belongs here either. But I am going to say it because it is what I actually believe, and the point of an oral record is to say what you actually believe. When I interviewed Sergeant Den on the 34th day of this investigation, at the end of the interview, he asked me a question. He asked, "Did you get what you needed?" I said I had found the interview helpful. I said I was still working on the category question. He said, "I hope you find it." I said, "You seem unbothered by the fact that we cannot categorize it." He said, "Yeah, I think that's about right." I said, "Does it matter to you that we are trying?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the ventilation system continued. The distant voices had moved somewhere else. He said, "It matters that she's okay. The rest of it, the category, the report, all of this, that's your job. I don't mean that as a dismissal. I just mean, you figure out what it means. That's not really my department. He stood up because we had finished, and he extended his left hand, not his right, which was still in the partial brace, and I took it, because this is a human gesture and I had learned it. And then he left. I have thought about that conversation a great deal. I have thought about the photograph in his personnel file, the one where he is squinting in bright light holding a fish, 4 years before any of this happened. I have thought about the 48 hours before the 53rd day of the unification cycle, when he stood in the 7th hall doing environmental mapping for 4 hours across 2 sessions, alone in the professional sense in which decorative guards are always alone, watching the entrance seams and the structural joints and the gaps between platforms, doing the real version of a job that no one expected him to take seriously. I have thought about what he said. The alternative wasn't available. I do not have a category for it. The conclave has created a designation. My division has produced 13 written drafts and 1 oral record. Rethova has written a note he was uncomfortable writing. Veloreth has not slept properly in 6 weeks. The Queen is alive. I think in the end that is the document we were always trying to produce. Not the written report, not the designation, not the category. Just that sentence, the Queen is alive. That is the fact the 48th minute of the 3rd session produced. Everything else we have been doing for 6 weeks has been an attempt to understand how one man who was not required to be there, who had correctly calculated that being there was likely to cost him his life, who did not decide to go but simply went, produced that sentence. I do not know how to file that. I do not think it fits in any folder my division currently has. But I know what it is. I think I have always known what it is. I think every species that has ever put a name to it has known what it is. The names are different. The words do not translate cleanly. The behavior, as Rethova's biological review confirms, and as 6 weeks of analysis confirms, and as 41 viewings of the same 90 seconds of security footage confirms, is not standard and is not predicted, and is not, by any model we have, the output that should follow from the inputs. It is nonetheless the output that followed. Sergeant Marcus Den has returned to duty. He is, by his medical clearance, fully recovered. The partial brace came off on day 38. The photograph in his personnel file is 4 years old, and I do not know who took it or whether that person knows what the man in the photograph did on the 53rd day of the unification cycle, or whether any of that matters to anyone except the people it happened to. I am going to close this record and file it in whatever folder the conclave determines is appropriate. I suspect wherever it ends up, it will not be alone. I suspect there are other folders in other archives on other worlds containing other attempts to name the same thing. I suspect those folders have been accumulating for longer than the V3 have been a spacefaring species, and that the naming attempts have not gotten much cleaner over time. Some things resist categorization. The Queen is alive. That's enough.